of the SVG National Trust.
I'm sorry, I didn't know where I was supposed to be. I hope I didn't break any rules by heading this way. The protocol has been listed extensively, so I want to adopt it, and I want to recognize the children who are here today. So, good afternoon, children. What school are you from? Langley Park. And you know who is Chateau? Yes? All right. I would also like to thank the Garifuna Heritage Foundation for the opportunity to speak at the 5th International Garifuna Conference, and to apologize for missing so much of it so far. I was there for only part of the opening ceremony yesterday, and unfortunately I missed Dr. Hume's presentation, which Vanessa tells me touches some of the things that I wish to speak about. And I particularly wanted to hear Dr. Fraser's presentation immediately before lunch on matters related essentially to the beginnings of Garifuna. But unfortunately I had some other meetings that clashed and ran a little bit long. We're already late, so I'm going to try to dive right in. And the issue that I'm going to speak about, given the topic of this particular conference, revolves around BALICEAUX, of course, but focuses on BALICEAUX's place in the historical arc of the Garifuna. And I start with a quote from a Bob Marley song that places in context, hopefully, what I intend to speak about. And the quote is from his song, Buffalo Soldier. And the verse is, if you know your history, then you will know where you're coming from. And you wouldn't have to ask me, who the hell do I think I am? For the Garinago and for the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, BALICEAUX is Gorée Island. And I believe Dr. Hume used a similar analogy. Like Gorée, an island off the coast of Senegal, BALICEAUX is the island from which an oppressed people last saw sight of their homeland. Both islands are colonial conveniences, sites to corral human cargo for onward export to distant lands. BALICEAUX and Gorée are islands of almost unimaginable suffering, indelibly stained across time with the blood of the ancestors. Now, there is some discussion among historians about the extent to which Gorée Island transshipped as many enslaved Africans as they now claim, but that does not detract from its symbolic power, certainly, in this narrative. But while the historical parallels are obvious and numerous, the modern differences between the two islands are stark. Gorée is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists and pilgrims each year. BALICEAUX, on the other hand, is privately owned, rarely visited, and marketed online as the, quote, Cinderella of the Grenadines, for an asking price of $30 million US. BALICEAUX's status has been a point of focus and contention, and continues to be, particularly among some members of the Garifuna diaspora, who have advanced a series of well-meaning and occasionally impractical suggestions to wrest BALICEAUX from private hands. While there are calls for the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to block the sale of the island or take it back from its private owners, it is worth noting that BALICEAUX's asking price exceeds the Vincentian government's total spending on capital works in all of 2017. The concerns regarding the status of BALICEAUX are valid and noble. However, the intensity of the focus on BALICEAUX is reductive and ultimately harmful to the proud and heroic history of the Garifuna in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. From the establishment of a strong and functioning society to the unprecedented wars against British colonialism and genocide. It is natural for diasporas to tell tales that begin at the point of their creation, begin at the point of the diaspora's creation, and oppressive historians to tell tales that diminish the glory of the civilizations that they subjugated. These tendencies have unwittingly conspired to create unfortunate historical starting points and markers that ill-serve the cultural significance of indigenous peoples. So, for too long, members of the African diaspora in the United States and the Caribbean heard a version of black history that began with the Middle Passage and slavery. In that telling of black history, Gorée Island is the starting point of a tale of tragedy and woe that culminates in the triumph and struggles of the present day. It took decades of curriculum revision and cultural realignment to expand the scope of the black diaspora beyond Gorée, the Middle Passage, and slavery. UNESCO made Gorée Island a World Heritage Site in 1978. Only later did UNESCO similarly recognize African triumphs like Mbaza Congo in Angola, the royal palaces of Abomey in Benin, the ruins in Burkina Faso, Lamu Old Town in Kenya, Timbuktu and the tomb of Askia in Mali, the historic center of Agadez in Niger, the stone circles of Senegambia in Senegal and the Gambia, and the rock art areas in Malawi and Tanzania. All of those recognitions, which speak to a time before Gorée, were not recognized until well after Gorée was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The tale of the Garifuna in St. Vincent and the Grenadines cannot begin with BALICEAUX, important as that island is to the historical journey of the people. It must necessarily begin with the life before European settlement and conquest. The story and our emphasis must be told and taught through knowledge and recognition of Garifuna culture, their art, and how they lived. Tales must be told of Garifuna military triumphs against the British. We must commemorate the sites of their greatest victories. We should appreciate the scope and scale of Garifuna settlement across YURNMEIN. And we must recognize the historic act of forcing the British to the negotiating table to sign the hemisphere's first military treaty between a colonizer and an indigenous people. Before we discuss the defeat of the Garifuna in YURNMEIN, let's talk about their creation. Do we leave the mythology of the Garifuna genesis to the jaundiced views of individual colonial propagandists? One British pen creation tale goes like this. In the mid-17th century, a slave ship with human cargo from Nigeria, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea was shipwrecked near St. Vincent while en route to Barbados. The surviving Africans were rescued by the Kalinago inhabitants of St. Vincent and brought ashore. According to Charles Shepherd, a British historian of the day, and I'm going to quote Mr. Shepherd, "The slaves who escaped from the wreck were received by the inhabitants, that's the Kalinago, as brethren. But this was not all. The proprietors of the island gave their daughters in marriage to these strangers, and the race which sprang from the mixture were called the Black Caribs, now the Garifuna, having preserved more of the primitive color of their fathers than the lighter hue of their mothers. That is the Charles Shepherd telling. There was a shipwreck. The Kalinago rescued the people on the ship, and they intermarried. But there's another British version of the story. The enslaved Africans who arrived in St. Vincent were murderers and outlaws who were captured by the local Caribs, enslaved by them, and who later fled into the hills to start their own black colony. William Young, the governor of St. Vincent, who gave his name to Young Island, paints this version of Garifuna creation. And now I'm going to quote William Young. The Negroes, or Black Caribs as they have been termed in later years, are descendants from the cargo of an African slave ship bound from the Bight of Benin to Barbados and wrecked about the year 1675 on the coast of Bequia. The Caribs, accustomed to fish in the narrow channel, soon discovered these Negroes, finding them in great distress for provisions, and particularly for water, with which Bequia was ill-equipped. And they had little difficulty in inveigling them into their canoes and transporting them across the narrow channel to St. Vincent, where they made slaves of them and set them to work. These Negroes were of the warlike Moko tribe from Africa, and soon proved restive and indocile servants to the less robust natives of the Western Ocean. The Caribs, apprehending danger should the slaves' numbers increase, came to a resolution of putting to death all their male children which should be born. This cruel policy occasioned a sudden insurrection of the blacks, who massacred such of the Caribs as they could take by surprise, and then fled, accompanied or followed by their wives and children to the woods and rocks which cover the high mountains in the northeast of St. Vincent. In these almost inaccessible fortresses, they found many other Negroes from the neighboring islands who, murderers or runaways, had fled from justice, revenge, or slavery. Incorporating with these Negro outlaws, they formed a nation, now known by the name of Black Caribs, a title themselves arrogated when entering into contests with their ancient masters. It's very different. This is a significant discrepancy in versions of the birth of the Garifuna. One paints a picture of Africans received as brethren and intermarrying with the local Kalinago population in a process of peaceful assimilation. The other version is one of slavery, war, and conflict with the Kalinago. More importantly, in Young's version of the tale, the Garifuna are not an indigenous population. They are simply the descendant of a group of Africans who lived together in the hills and whose incidental mixed offspring were the result of war and conquest, not peaceful intermarriage. Young's motivation in penning this tale was to negate British sympathy for the plight of the indigenous peoples against whom he personally prosecuted a genocidal campaign. But should we not tell the definitive tale of the creation of the Garifuna? Should we not lay out evidence of African Kalinago intermarriage and admixture of cultures, customs like the flattening of the foreheads, the ways in which the dead were honored, the language? All of these things and more collectively tell a story that is at odds with Young's creation myth. But the story of the birth of the Garifuna should not simply be the subject of competing colonial conjecture. It should be our story, told and taught by us. The British estimate that there were about 10,000 Kalinago and Garifuna living across St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Given the colonial unfamiliarity with the Vincentian interior, this is likely to have been an undercounted number. However, at the time of the so-called First Carib War of 1772, the Kalinago and the Garifuna likely outnumbered the combined population of whites and enslaved Africans in St. Vincent. What do we know about these thousands of Garifuna in St. Vincent? Where did they live? How did they live? Yes, 2,500 Garifuna died on BALICEAUX, but over 10,000 lived in St. Vincent. In an indignant 1765 letter to the British government, requesting permission to evict the Garifuna from their lands and resettle them on Bequia at the time. This is before they were resettled forcibly to BALICEAUX. St. Vincent Commissioners Greg, William Young again, Robert Stewart and Robert Wynne. We now have somewhere called Mount Wynne. This is where Robert Wynne is from. We have somewhere called Young Island. That's where Governor Young was from. But they wrote a letter to the British way before the exile to BALICEAUX, proposing an exile to Bequia. And this was before any war. And the letter said, the Caribs are altogether uncivilized, and the blacks particularly of an idle, intractable disposition. They live in huts, scattered in an irregular manner, at a great distance from each other, without any established subordination, claiming large tracts of the woodland intervening, of which they make no use, and are besides possessed of other lands in the cleared parts of the country, which interfere much with the laying out of plantations for sale. Well, you see, as the Prime Minister indicated yesterday, a lot of this was always about land. But there are some things in there that are worth thinking about, and I want you to remember their description of them living in huts scattered in an irregular manner in St. Vincent. The idea of relocating the Garifuna to Bequia was scuttled in part because, and I'm quoting Governor Young here, Bequia, though a beautiful and most healthy island, is deficient in rivers, essential to the comfort and satisfaction of the Caribs. Unquote. Beyond the genocidal plot to uproot and relocate an entire indigenous population to another island, hatched years before the First Carib War, these letters provide useful information about Garifuna life. What do we know today about the Garifuna homes and their integration with the natural environment, to say nothing of the natural defenses afforded by the surrounding woodlands and their allegedly irregular layout? Also, the British records demonstrate the centrality of rivers and the oceans to Garifuna life. Rivers were essential to their comfort. Similarly, the seas and fishing were so crucial to the Garifuna that even after they and the British signed a treaty to divide St. Vincent essentially in half in the aftermath of the First Carib War, the treaty provided that entire liberty of fishing, as well as on the coast of St. Vincent and the neighboring keys, to be allowed to the Caribs. The settlement of Duvalet, the Carib chief situated in the northeastern extremity of the island, was so well fortified and so well situated strategically that the British could only attack it by sea. Is the site of this town marked by signage and information? Has it been studied by archaeologists? Is the settlement of a Garifuna chief, where people lived and died and fought colonialism, not worthy of focused study and attention? Governor William Young writes that Grand Sable was, quote, the richest and principal settlement of the Caribs, where Chief Joseph Chatoyer presided over grand councils. A Frenchman, Blavaes, I'm not sure how to pronounce these words. I'm looking at the only French speaker I know in the room. Sailed via canoe with a Garifuna trader from St. Lucia to St. Vincent in 1793 and landed at what he called Grand Sable, the principal wharf of the Caribs. In a marked contrast to Young's characterization of the irregular and scattered huts of Garifuna villages, Lavaes stated that, and I quote, the properties of the Caribs were divided by hedges of orange trees, perfectly well kept, and their gardens filled with all the beautiful plants of the country. Their houses had an appearance of elegant simplicity and were provided with all that could be necessary for comfort and convenience. He went on to describe one such house as built of squared timber and covered with shingles. A gallery ran in front of it and was divided into 3 rooms, of which that in the middle served as a saloon. It's a different description of the irregular huts. Is Grand Sable not deserving of our recognition as an apparent hub of Garifuna life, commerce, and politics? Should we not be locating the truth between Lavaes's condescendingly saccharine descriptions of Garifuna life and the dismissive British portrayals of indolent savages in irregularly scattered huts? The answers to these questions are of critical historical significance. British history records many epic battles across St. Vincent over the so-called First and Second Carib Wars. La Croix, Yambu, Chateaubelair, Layou, Curtains, Walibu, Oya, Keene Hall, Fairbairn, Fountain, Calder, Acres, Carapan, Connery, Mount Young, Rabaca, etc. All of these areas were the sites of major battles with the Garifuna. At the Three Rivers Estate, a detachment of British militia and enslaved Africans was outflanked, outmaneuvered, and surrounded by Garifuna warriors. According to Shepard, I quote again, 31 persons lost their lives. The greatest part of them, and when he says 31 persons, he means not Garifuna persons, because they were not persons. 31 British persons. 31 persons lost their lives, the greatest part of them the most promising young men in the colony. The defeated and disheartened troop, in their precipitate and disorderly flight to Kingstown, communicated terror and dismay to all the inhabitants of the Windward Country as they passed. The alarm was sudden and irresistible. In a moment, both whites and blacks abandoned their abodes, leaving behind them almost everything they possessed, being no further solicitous than to hasten from the present rapidly approaching ruin. These are people and warriors of some skill who set to flight a British detachment, who were so scared that they were running through towns and frightening everybody that passed them. And all of those people who were frightened were gathering their things and running as well. This is not indolent savages. This speaks to something more than that. In the closing days of the second so-called Carib War, even after the death of Chatoyer, the Garifuna continued to score victories against the British. On March 21st, 1797, the Garifuna laid waste to British settlements from Calequa to Sion Hill. I quote again, the most valuable part of the town of Calequa was burnt. And once they were so daringly resolute, at midday, in defiance of guns, as to advance to the very base of Sion Hill and to set fire the sugar works at Arnesvale Estate, which were totally consumed in a few hours. The Villa, Belmont, and Fairhall estates shared the same fate. Remember the story we know about Chateauye? He was killed, the Garifuna were disheartened, they surrendered, and gladly accepted exile to BALICEAUX. But this is a different story. The extended battles in the hills surrounding what is now called the VG Highway saw many pivotal Garifuna victories. Yet, with the exception of the monument on Dorsetshire Hill, which marks the site where Chateauye was allegedly killed, there are no physical markers to commemorate these historic battles against colonialism and exploitation. There is no acknowledgement of these numerous sites of sacred ground where noble Garifuna blood soaked the soil of their fatherland. The theme of this conference in referring to BALICEAUX presents a seemingly zero-sum dichotomy between sacred ground and economic opportunity. Increasingly, and I believe Dr. Hume touched on this, so forgive me if I traverse ground that she has traversed. Increasingly, modern global trends show this to be an increasingly irrelevant distinction. In many places around the world, sacred ground is synonymous with economic opportunity. From the 15 million Muslim pilgrims to Mecca each year, to the 2 million who converge in the Auschwitz Holocaust Memorial Site, to the more modest 200,000 annual visitors to Gorée Island itself. It is entirely possible to tastefully and respectfully honor the past while also capitalizing on visitors and opportunities in the present. For example, the somber Gettysburg Memorial in Pennsylvania, in the United States, which I've visited, sees 1.2 million visitors each year who spend $650 million US and employ 7,500 persons in surrounding Adams County. Imagine, if you will, a tour of Garifuna sites of interest in St. Vincent, with knowledgeable guides sharing Garifuna history with local students, the Garifuna diaspora, and tourists alike. Imagine informational signs and plaques marking sites of interest. Imagine maps and trails that allow you to walk where Chateauye walked on his advance to Kingstown. Think of replica villages, of interactive museums where Garifuna artwork, culture, and cuisine collide for education and enjoyment. Think of driving up the Windward Coast, crossing the Beira River, and encountering a sign that marks the beginning of the territory ceded to the Garifuna by the treaty after the First Carib War. Each town from there forward, Georgetown, Mount Bentic, Orange Hill, Sandy Bay, Point, Oya, Fancy, etc., could be marked and recognized as Garifuna towns, with opportunities to educate about Kalinago and Garifuna life before the British, before the Carib Wars, and before the 1773 treaty that split St. Vincent in half. Similarly, crossing the Waliabo River on the leeward side would take you through Garifuna towns of Spring Village, Trumaka, Rosebank, Petit Bodel, Chateaubelair, and Fitzhughes. If I can deviate for a second, going on right now in another building in Kingstown is a coding session with some programmers who are learning how to use a program called OpenStreetMap, which is a map of, well, in this case, a map of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's a lot like Google Maps, but the difference is that you can put your own information directly and superimpose it on the map. And I've challenged them over the course of this program to produce a Garifuna trail so that you can have an app on your phone that will guide you to locations of interest and historical significance of the Garifuna. Now, the difficulty there is that many of the programmers don't have the historical perspective, but they've agreed to do the programming work if people like the foundation can do the historical work to locate some of these sites and make it something that can be visited, not only by tourists. I mean, tourists are important, but more important are Vincentians and members of the Garifuna diaspora. Think of a replica slave ship or other memorial on the Bekwai coast to mark the point of landing of the enslaved Africans who later produced the Garifuna with indigenous Kalinago. Would you visit such a site? And I missed Dr. Fraser's discussion of the creation of the Garifuna. And I haven't had an opportunity to even hear what his central thesis was. But there's an interesting website that I spend altogether too much time on. That's called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And that website is www.slavevoyages.org. And it's maintained by a number of universities. And the quest of that website is to document every single ship that traveled with enslaved Africans from Africa to the New World. And they've done a phenomenal job so far. It's an ongoing thing. But I want to read you a footnote from here. I'm going back to the creation myth for a second. Remember, the myth is that, and when I say myth, I'm not saying myth in a pejorative term. I'm just saying the story of the creation is that a slave ship ran aground. Governor Young says around 1675, I believe. And it was coming from the Bight of Benin to Barbados. This is all his telling. And that those slaves, those enslaved Africans, intermarried with the Kalinago. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database records a vessel named the Amity, which acquired enslaved Africans in Adra, Benin, and was bound for Barbados, and whose voyage was thwarted by a natural hazard shipwreck. And the Amity held 404 enslaved Africans and disappeared in 1680. A similar Barbados-bound shipwreck from the Bight of Benin occurred on an unnamed vessel piloted by a Captain Fullwood in 1682. And that vessel had a similar complement of enslaved Africans. In 1683, a ship called the Blessing followed a similar path and met a similar fate, but it had a cargo of only 67 enslaved Africans. It is unknown, obviously, if any of these vessels or other records in the database hold clues to the African origins of the Garifuna, because there were quite a few Barbados-bound shipwrecks during the 1630s. But I believe this is a question that merits deeper analysis historically, because there's data there now about many of these ships, and we should look into which, if any, of those ships could possibly further anchor the tale of the creation of the Garifuna. BALICEAUX today is private property, as it was over 220 years ago when the Garifuna were exiled there in 1797. Shepard reveals that at the time, BALICEAUX was owned by a Mr. Campbell, who, quote, cheerfully loaned BALICEAUX to the British for the purpose of turning it into a Garifuna internment camp. The colonists of St. Vincent later paid him £1,731 and 15 shillings, which is about $215,000 in today's money, for his losses and for his inconvenience in temporarily giving up BALICEAUX for this purpose. BALICEAUX is one of many Grenadine islands that have been privately owned since before St. Vincent and the Grenadines reacquired its independence from the British in 1979. Isle de Cat, which is currently on sale for $50 million, Mustique, Petit St. Vincent, and other examples exist of this phenomenon of privately owned Grenadine islands that have never been held by the independent government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The YURNMEIN Declaration, which exists on the Garifuna Heritage Foundation's website, recommends that, quote, the island of BALICEAUX be preserved and protected as a sacred heritage site for the use of future generations, unquote. I unequivocally support the noble sentiment behind this recommendation. However, it is difficult to reconcile the sentiment of an $80 million, this is EC dollars, $80 million 320-acre heritage site with the current realities of a heavily indebted small island state advancing a laundry list of urgent and expensive developmental priorities. Indeed, it would be more feasible to purchase the island privately through a collection of $150 from each of the 200,000 plus people of Garifuna descent, because that would buy it, than it would be to expect short or medium-term state action on this front. Of course, once bought, you would have and held in common by 200,000 people. You would have a whole host of administrative and management issues when one group says they want to build a hotel there and another group says they want to do something else, and that would create its own challenges. But it's food for thought. Of course, there can be more modest and practical BALICEAUX-related objectives that stop short of a full 320-acre acquisition by the state. The set-aside of a small portion of the island as a heritage site by purchase, acquisition, agreement, or mandate in the alien landholding license of a potential purchaser could be a viable option. So too could other arrangements, like perhaps negotiating the waiver of a certain percentage of stamp duty and taxes in exchange for a footprint on BALICEAUX to be preserved for historical purposes. These and other practical and potentially workable possibilities should be discussed and debated by civil society. And I'm not here advancing anyone that I am advocating. I'm just saying that this either-or discussion has been going on for quite a while, and there are some limitations given the size of our economy. And so we should discuss other potential ways to honor the Garifuna on BALICEAUX, short of a 320-acre acquisition. However, more fundamental than these modest compromises is an analysis of the place of BALICEAUX itself in Garifuna history and mythology. Where do we situate the 7 months of suffering and death on BALICEAUX in a grand and unique historical arc that covers migration from both South America and Africa, generations of settlement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, coexistence, treaties, alliances, and wars with colonial invaders, genocide, exile, and resettlement, both internally in St. Vincent and externally in Honduras, Belize, and Nicaragua, and the rebirth of today's borderless and proud Garifuna nation. The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines has focused its attention on other aspects of the unique place of the Garifuna as a cornerstone of our history and national identity. Paramount Chief Joseph Chatoyer was named a national hero. Plans have been announced to construct a heritage park at Rabaka. In his 2017 independence address, the Prime Minister declared his government's intention to commission and publish a definitive book on Vincentian history. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been the Caribbean's leading voice in pursuit of reparatory justice for African slavery and native genocide. The Prime Minister mentioned, and I recognize the work of the Speaker of the House as the head of St. Vincent's Reparations Committee and the sterling work he's done in advocating reparatory justice in our perspective. The Prime Minister mentioned also St. Vincent and the Grenadines voting for and ratifying the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. These stances are evidence of a strong state commitment to advance Garifuna history, recognition, and reparatory justice amid modern Vincentian realities. Indeed, many of these stances touch and concern other issues that are raised in the YURNMEIN Declaration. Undoubtedly, the war which led to the exile of the Garifuna is a moment of massive historical significance. That war led to in rough numbers, 2,500 Garifuna deaths on BALICEAUX. It is undeniably sacred ground. But that same war also produced 2,500 deaths on St. Vincent itself. It is also sacred ground. Rotan Island in Honduras, site of the Garifuna landing in Central America, is sacred ground. The question is not whether BALICEAUX is sacred ground. That is self-evident. The question is, where do we locate that sacred ground in the terrain of Garifuna history and self-image? 5 years ago, I was invited by Rutgers University to address the New Jersey Folk Festival's celebration of Garifuna history and culture. I spoke then of what I termed the Garifuna miracles: surviving capture in Africa and the Middle Passage, being shipwrecked on one of the few remaining free and independent islands in the Caribbean at the time, being rescued, welcomed, and assimilated with the Kalinago, securing one of the first treaties in history between the mighty British Empire and an indigenous people, surviving genocide, and growing from a defeated and exiled people to a population of over 200,000 descendants across Central America, North America, and the Caribbean. Miracles. In that speech, I quoted Special Magistrate John Anderson, an Englishman stationed in St. Vincent and the Grenadines 40 years after the exile of the Garifuna. In his journal, Anderson, an unabashed racist, shared the view that, I quote, "It is certainly a surprising fact that so insignificant a body as the Caribs, amounted to, when finally transported to the island of Rotan in the Bay of Honduras, being 5,000 men, women, and children in March 1797, should have for 2 years baffled the energies of Great Britain." And let's consider that for a moment. In 1772, a people numbering 10,000, let's use their number, poor, technologically disadvantaged people, merited an order from England, and I'm quoting their order, to send 2 regiments from North America to join such troops as could be spared from the neighboring islands to reduce the Caribs to a due submission. That war failed, and the Garifuna came away with a treaty in which, according to Shepard, the most fertile and beautiful part of the island was ceded to them in perpetuity. A second war, 22 years later, planned and fought with overwhelming British military superiority, still baffled the energies of the world's greatest colonial power for over 2 years. A story lies therein that has relatively little to do with the geographical confines of BALICEAUX itself. The enduring story of the Garifuna, to my mind, is one of the indomitable will of a people who refuse to surrender, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. It is a story of miracles, victories, and triumphs over adversity. As the now cliched proverb goes, until the lions have their own historian, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. When the colonizers and oppressors told the story of the Garifuna, they told it through the prism of their victories and located it at the sites of their triumphs, Dorsetshire Hill and BALICEAUX. Undoubtedly, We must reassess, reclaim, and retell those stories with new voices and new perspectives. However, we must also tell other stories, new stories, and focus on other locales that tell a tale not only of misery, defeat, and death, but of the lives of a great people in a great nation that achieved and continue to achieve great things. When an exiled or displaced diaspora tells the story of their origin, they are tempted to begin at the point of their exile or displacement. But BALICEAUX is neither a beginning nor an end. It is a way station, albeit a hugely significant one, on an epic historical journey that established this country, resisted colonial exploitation, helped shape Central America, and gifted the world its culture as an internationally recognized masterpiece of intangible heritage of humanity. Such a journey cannot be told through the jaundiced eyes of colonial rationalizers, appeasers, or apologists. His story cannot be swallowed as our story. And in telling so significant a story as the Garifuna, I respectfully suggest that we begin our focus not on the branch, or the stem, or the fruit, but the root. That root extends far deeper and far earlier than the sorrowful 7-month sojourn on BALICEAUX. Thank you very much for your attention.